I think that the natural direction that most slasher franchises tend to go after several installments is towards the realm of folklore. These stories are given a mythos, rooted in a legend that the individual narratives of these franchises treat as a pretty big deal each time. The legendary angle to these stories, I think, is due to the fact that these are franchises. The worlds built from each series' first installment are embellished on in sequels and develop into stories about the stories. After a time, the legend sort of takes over the story and becomes the more essential piece to remember. The issue becomes what I consider to be a disconnect between the icon of the legend and time. As more installments of a franchise are given the difficult task of maintaining the legend while still attempting to change something, the stories become more disjointed and unfamiliar. Some even appear to lose sight of what makes the legend initially iconic or memorable, and others sacrifice originality and quality on preserving the legend to an inconsequential result. The Friday the 13th movies are not exempt from this. In fact, they swing both ways in that regard. But for a brief moment in its history of endless sequels, 12 films in total, it appeared to understand itself perfectly both as a responsible piece of movie folklore and as a piece of consumer-based entertainment. I'm talking about Jason Lives, the 6th installment of the franchise in which Jason Voorhees and his series of films are literally resurrected and forced to continue on despite the clear burnout of... Okay, I'm actually gonna slow down. So, spoilers for 1984's Friday the 13th, Part 4, The Final Chapter, if that's something you're worried about being spoiled for you. The film was marketed as an ending. I mean, the title of it was The Final Chapter. But still, the series continued on after this installment's success with its 5th entry, The New Beginning, being released a year later. The movie, it turns out, and I guess spoilers again for Friday the 13th Part 5, Jason is not the killer. It's a copycat killer pretending to be Jason. So, point being, Paramount had no plans to slow down the franchise. They were still going to do a sequel every year. But that begs the question, how do we do that? Jason is dead, and unless we're planning on introducing a copycat killer we can kill off every movie going forward, I don't really see how... Oh. A zombie. He's a zombie. This is gonna suck, right? This is definitely gonna suck. Okay, I know what it looks like. A studio wanted to make more money on their IP, so they went in the campiest possible direction and literally brought it back from the dead so that they could... Oh wait, actually, this is kind of interesting, wait. Yes, Jason Lives is a commercial product. Blockbusters are. They are inherently made with an audience in mind. And what I've always found so interesting about movies like this one is that they're aware that this is for an audience. And they want to make sure they responsibly say something about the nature of the audience, at least every so often. In a way, films like this are using their platform to discuss what the platform can even imply and pull back the curtain on what kinds of films we might have to expect in this new context. A film made in a franchise for fans is not the same as a film made by an artist for themselves or other artists, and when a franchise film understands this, I think it stands to maintain a lot of its soul, and maybe even ask that we look into our own. I mean, consider the opening sequence of Jason Lives. Tommy Jarvis, who once upon a time killed Jason as a young boy, is still obsessed with him due to the trauma he inflicted on him and his family. So he visits Jason's grave for no other reason than to find closure, and as soon as he sees the body, Tommy feels to me like what was becoming a cult consciousness over movies like this. The franchise is literally dead and buried in front of us, but we want to see more of it anyway because of how it affected us when it did. In Tommy's case, it was as a child, so his trauma reads to me like nostalgia in the subtext of the film. He can't get Jason out of his head. And this twisted affection for the character, for the IP, leads our audience surrogate to literally force Jason back into existence, albeit accidentally. The studios saw an opportunity to make more money, fans wanted more Friday the 13th, so what other choice did they have but to hit him with lightning and make him unstoppable? It's ridiculous, and I think it knows it. Jason Lives introduces itself as a film that understands what matters to cult franchises. The cult. It's about the perpetual forward momentum of slasher films of the 80s, and what extent one has to go to keep such a thing alive for as long as it does. It's a lot like the device frequently used in the Nightmare on Elm Street series, making Freddy Krueger a monster that only exists because of the fear and memories of those that encounter him, so that he'll live on forever. Forcing Jason Voorhees out of his grave is very much the same thing. These conceits are inherently saying something about franchises, that they just can't die. So now that I've already given away the central theme of the movie just talking about how the movie starts, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how Jason Lives keeps itself running with narrative events that lend to theme. Careful for spoilers. I talk really often about self-awareness in media, and while I'm a little wary of the kind of stuff that at times feels like being meta is more novel than being actually consciously aware of what it's deconstructing, I'm still generally happy to see stuff that cares about what it's saying, especially in recent horror films. Horror has been an incredible source of commentary on how we experience a whole lot of things, including other movies. Just gonna give one example here, but I hear often that the new It movie isn't scary because of all the excessive jump scares present throughout the narrative. But what makes that film so effective to me is that it would be scary to me as a kid, because it's got excessive jump scares and scary images in it. And like in the book it's based on, the first of the new films is about kids and the tangible things they fear rather than the more existential things that adults fear. So the movie's form and jumpy loud editing makes a lot of sense to me. It's using film techniques to address the same themes as the novel it's based on. It, Chapter 1, is an R-rated kids movie, the way I see it, and I think that's dope. And, I can't wait for Chapter 2 to come out so it can prove me wrong and I'll regret saying any of this, but until then, let's talk about what Jason Lives does in a meta-narrative sense. I want to get this out of the way fast because it's used to death and I'm certain a lot of us know how this works. You look at a convention, you say, oh, I can subvert that by doing either the opposite of it or something completely different altogether, and then you do that. Jason Lives does some of that stuff for sure. It subverts plenty, which you might feel obligated to do if you want to feel justified in being a sixth installment of any franchise. But I think that narratively, the film actually does much less to be meta and plays a lot of its horror straight, warts and all. And when it does, I think it does it really well. I think that Jason Lives has more interest in showing us why conventions are effective rather than trying to spend a ridiculous amount of time forcing us to see why they're not. It understands why these tropes work and why they're used so often, and uses what few meta elements they have to elevate the stuff that isn't textually meta. I mean, think about those 2 consecutive shots from earlier. It starts with an acknowledgement of the trope, and then it shows you the trope anyway. There's a marriage here between theme and narrative where the movie appears to be using one to complement the other. So if both aspects of this movie were just split down the middle between base narrative and theme, the text of this thing would be probably considered boring and bad, because it's mostly slasher movie convention at the surface, right? I mean, movie monster comes back from the dead and kills a bunch of people before finally being killed again. Oh. So we have our central theme about the resurrection of stories in order to preserve franchises. And we have our narrative reverence for tropes in order to push back on complete subversion. Both of these things are linked not only in how they work alone to tell us about what these filmmakers think about movies, but also in how they work together to tell us about the importance of legends. Jason Lives makes a point of taking what is important to the preservation of a legend, both in its history and its potential for growth, and asking that we not forget about one of those things to embellish on the other when translating that to a franchise. We have our context, which is years and years of stories about Jason Voorhees and his mother and Camp Crystal Lake to draw from, which of course includes the use of tropes in order to keep the story going. And then we have the acknowledgement of this goal. The meta text telling us that this is meant to be a literal resurrection of the story in order to allow for it to continue on. Both of these pieces are present in the film simultaneously at one moment, which comes together to make Jason Lives the perfect piece of cinematic folklore. Its final shots. No Friday the 13th movie could really do this before. They act each time as if Jason was dead, but from time to time with an uncomfortable allusion to something still being out there, because sequels. And Jason Lives even calls back to this, but this time actually physicalizes the meaning of it by moving beyond the ripples of water and showing us their source. And ultimately, what's in store. This is Jason Voorhees. This is 80s slasher films, and this is horror folklore, all in just a few images. The villain is not dead. He's just defeated, and he will absolutely be back. The villain can never die, and neither can this series, and neither can this story. With this very moment, we are able to see why franchises are made, and how they are at times forced to continue beyond what they originally started as. There are plenty of reasons for stories to end. And the Friday the 13th movies definitely did not need more than one installment. But if they were doomed to continue, I'm ecstatic that the film at the literal center of all of it became wise of its own history, and added at least one piece of the story that would almost make up for some of what preceded it, and what followed it. The Friday the 13th franchise, like most slasher franchises, became a game of devolution throughout its existence. The campfire story angle of Jason Voorhees was shelved in Part 7 in favor of trying something new. And Part 8 swung in the opposite direction, attempting to make the character's history and the legend tied directly into the actions and insecurities of the main character. And Part 9, and on it swung between the two, and the franchise never seemed to find the same balance that Part 6 had, which is fine. A lot of those movies that followed it are actually really neat and really interesting on their own. I especially dig what Part 8 was trying to do, and Jason X is just incredible. But anyway, movies that understand themselves and want to be understood are becoming few and far between, and it's cool to see that a movie doesn't necessarily have to be this ridiculous high art meta explosion of perfect form and technical mastery to be meaningful. I think that it's awesome that Part 6 exists, and part of that does come from a place of money and excessive franchise maintenance, unfortunately. But franchises are often inherently rooted in these problematic aspirations, and the least we can hope to extrapolate from these attempts to both make money and say something is in the attempt itself. And for the record, I think Jason Lives is more than just an attempt. Self-aware but certain of its purpose, Jason Lives is a testament to the uncomfortable power of popular culture. The fact that this was not an outright supernatural series for years, and then it suddenly was because the series and the monster demanded that it be in order to keep them both alive, is emblematic of the weight that the earlier installments had in establishing a canon that is seen by many as legendary. This legend, told over and over, changed slightly each time, or not changed at all, establishes this and other franchises as cinematic folktales. And Jason Lives directly puts that into words.